Our next speaker, Michiel Plomp, studied art history at the University of Utrecht and Groningen. His PhD was about the collecting of drawings in Holland in the 18th century. This resulted in an exhibition at the Fondation Custodia in Paris in 2001. Michiel worked as a curator in several Dutch museums, such as the Centraal Museum in Utrecht and the Rembrandt House in Amsterdam. And from 1999 until 2006, he was curator of Northern European drawings at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Today, we welcome him back to New York, even though he is chief curator of the art collections at the Teylers Museum in Haarlem, the oldest museum in the Netherlands, where he has worked on drawings exhibitions about Rembrandt, Raphael, and Claude Lorrain. Today, Michiel's paper is titled Rembrandt and His Time. Please join me in welcoming Michiel Plomp.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Inge, for inviting me here. It's great to be back in New York, although for a very short time. And it's wonderful to be among so many drawing lovers for these 2 days. So thank you very much. Artist collectors, Rembrandt and His Time. As you all know, the 17th century was a period of great wealth and prosperity in the Dutch Republic. Towns and cities grew and flourished, and a host of artists were kept very busy indeed. It has been calculated that by 1650, there were 750 master painters in the country. Some of them had collections of drawings, sometimes large, sometimes small. And it's on them that I would shed some light today. Here are two of them. Caspar Netscher, a self-portrait with his palette on the left, and Jan van der Capelle, portrayed by Rembrandt van den Eekhout, as an independent gentleman on the right. Caspar Netscher was a successful, well-to-do genre and portrait painter. The inventory of his collection lists several albums of drawings and prints, among which a series of 80 drawn illustrations for a Dutch comic novel by Leonard Bramer. Unfortunately, he is one of the very few artists to be mentioned by name. The albums probably contained much of Netscher's own work in the form of, and I quote, drawings for accessories in the paintings, such as vases, statues, background material, and so on. Or studies of hands in every kind of position. And that's why I'm showing these two hands from the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. And finally, a portfolio of prints and drawings of little value, 300 sheets, to be copied by pupils. In other words, mainly drawings for his own or studio use. Jan van der Capelle was a landscape painter and a merchant. He moved in the wealthiest Amsterdam circles and was very well off himself. His last will shows that in addition to immense cash assets, he owned extensive properties and one of the largest art collections in the country. Van der Capelle had 200 paintings and 7,000 drawings, among them 900 by Hendrik Averkamp, 500 by Rembrandt, 1,300 by Simon de Vlieger, probably his teacher, and there were 800 drawings by himself. I'm showing you this Rembrandt drawing from the Morgan Library because one of the Rembrandt portfolios was described as mothers and children. So it's quite likely that this drawing, as has already been suggested by Jane Turner in her catalogue, that this particular drawing was once in the collection of Jan van der Capelle. The Hendrik Averkamp drawings are not described, but since there were 900, that must have been almost the complete estate of the artist. So I'm just showing at random one example from the collection in Chicago. It appears that Van der Capelle acquired most of these works long after he had developed his own style. It's partly for that reason and its size that the collection rises above everyday studio use. This was truly an art lover's hobby. We will range between these two poles. Artists who had no need to paint for a living and their hard-working colleagues who did, with all sorts of variations in between and and of course all kinds of collections. Oh, this is a little too quick. Naturist's studio collection was in a way related to the so-called studio thesaurus or studio treasure. The masters of the large 15th century workshops created such troves as a source for their own work. They contained drawings of every kind that could contribute to the successful operation of the shop, and they were scrupulously passed on from father to son. Although the practice gradually declined, it was not abandoned entirely. That's Abraham Bloemaert. Abraham Bloemaert's drawings, for instance, remained together within the family until the 18th century. I'm showing you, again, at random more or less, two drawings by Bloemaert from the Giroux album. They stayed together even with it, until the 19th century, but the main bulk of Bloemaert's drawings stayed together in the family until the 18th century. Another example of this continuing use is provided by the Ter Borch family. Gerard Ter Borch the Elder, the father of the well-known genre painter, put together a modest collection that was not only clearly associated with his studio, but it was also a family record. For he preserved his children's drawings, which later passed to his daughter Gesina. It was a legacy that remained in the family until 1886, when it was acquired by the Rijksmuseum. So on the left you see Gerard Ter Borch the Elder, portrayed by his son Moses. In the middle, a self-portrait by Gesina, and on the right, a self-portrait by Gerard the Younger. The Art Lovers collection, as embodied by Van de Capelles, originated in the late 16th century. An early example was the one put together by Joris Hoefnagel. In a letter of 1593, he wrote that he was going to carry on collecting drawings and already had work by 300 artists. In another letter to Nicolas Gaddi, about whom we have just heard this fascinating talk by Andrew Morrow, to Nicolas Gaddi, he indicated that he was prepared to exchange sheets. He had northern artists and was eager to get Italians, like Michelangelo and Titian. Raphael was not necessary, he had already Raphaels enough. And that's at the end of the 16th century. That's quite amazing. Since Hoefnagel so specifically mentioned 300 artists and wanted to have Italian as well as Dutch masters, one suspects that his aim was to compile a documentary overview, possibly arranged chronologically in a manner of the Libro dei Disegni of Giorgio Vasari, or that of Gaddi, perhaps. Leaving that aside, what concerns us here is that in the 17th century Netherlands, there were studio collections, those put together by connoisseurs. Those functions, incidentally, are not mutually exclusive, but often spill over into each other. Which Dutch artists collected drawings in the 17th century? Abraham Bredius, the once a director of the Mauritshuis in The Hague, did a great deal of research on this subject around 1900. In his 7-volume Kunstler-Inventare, or art inventories, he published more than 300 inventories, mainly of 16th and 17th century Netherlandish artists. Going through them and combining them with later archival publications, such as by Bas Dudok van Heel or John Michael Montias, whose archive, by the way, is of course here at the Frick, I have arrived at this obviously far from complete list of 17th century Dutch master painters with drawing collections both large and small. Some of the names I'm sure you know, like Nicolaas Berchem or Jan van de Capelle, whom I just discussed briefly. Cornelis Dussart, Govert Flink are well-known names, of course, Rembrandt and Pieter Saredam. But don't be afraid, I'm not going to discuss them all. That will take way too long. I'll pick some interesting cases, like Cornelis Dussart. You see a portrait of him on the left. Cornelis Dussart had clearly a work-related collection. He was a pupil of Adriaan van Ostade and followed in his footsteps in many respects. He also inherited his master's estate and put it to use by copying van Ostade's works and even completing his paintings and drawings. In the middle, you see a small drawing from the Morgan collection again, and the figures were done by van Ostade, but the whole background and filling in of the drawing was done by Dussart. Dussart also owned a large number of drawings of prints by other artists, among them the Haarlem colleagues Cornelis Bega, de Braai brothers, and Gerrit Bergheide. Dussart's drawings display not only van Ostade's influence, but also of that of those other artists. One sees it, for example, in regular and carefully executed sheets of figure studies, like this sitting peasant on the right. Executed in colored chalks and sometimes in watercolor too, drawings like this are close in style to both Bega and de Braai. It was in this way that van Ostade figures, which were no more than preliminary studies, gave birth to exceptional drawings like these autonomous works of art, which at the time were eagerly acquired by drawing collectors. Pieter Saredam, the church painter, had a more differentiated collection. He managed to acquire groups and books of drawings from the estates of several Haarlem artists. One of his albums was still completely intact at the end of the 18th century. It contained sheets like the Goltzius, which you see on the right, The Mystic Marriage of St. Catherine, and Frans Floris's Martyrdom of St. John. Saredam's collection betrays a penchant for architecture, which is hardly surprising, given his specialty as an architectural painter. He owned the famous Roman sketchbooks by Maarten van Heemskerk, which are now in Berlin. Here you see a clearly adaptation by Saredam after one of these drawings from the Heemskerk sketchbook. The painting by Saredam is one of his rare Italian landscapes, but it's exactly the same composition which he used from a drawing in his collection. Saredam also had several albums with drawings and measurements of the Church of St. Bavo in Haarlem, as well as volumes with drawings of classical architecture. A working and connoisseur's collection merge seamlessly here. That was probably also the case with the best-known Dutch artist of the 17th century, Rembrandt. He had a large number of works on paper, as recorded in the 1656 inventory of his bankrupt estate. As is well known, it contained a lot of his own works. There were 30 portfolios, albums, packages full of drawings, all by himself. In addition, there were portfolios of prints by almost all the famous masters of the day, from the Netherlands, from Germany, from Italy. Rembrandt certainly had drawings by other masters as well, but far fewer than the prints. Hardly any names are mentioned, only Pieter Lastman, Adriaan Brouwer, and Roeland Saverij, by the latter Tyrolese mountain landscapes. Each one was given his own portfolio, two in the case of Pieter Lastman, Rembrandt's teacher. Then there were 2 albums of drawings by the principal masters of the entire world. All in all, there were probably around 300 to 400 drawings by other masters in Rembrandt's collection. That is not all that many. And to just mention Saredam, for instance, had already more. There are a number of sheets in Rembrandt's drawn oeuvre, and even in the oeuvre of one of his friends, that are copies or borrowings from other masters. They betray, so to speak, what Rembrandt may have had. And here you see on the right 2 drawings by Saverij of these Tyrolese mountain landscapes. And on the left, you see two copies after them by his friend Lambert Domer. Domer could have copied these drawings while they were still in Rembrandt's possession. There is also a possibility that he acquired the whole volume at the sale of Rembrandt's goods. There are also quite some copies by Rembrandt himself after Italian drawings. Here you see on the left the entombment by Rembrandt, which he made after a composition from the Raphael School, which is now in the Folk Art Museum. And other examples after Titian that Rembrandt made. Here are two examples of copies by him, one in Chatsworth and the other at the Fondation Custodia in Paris. And more examples, on the left Titian, on the right Rembrandt in Berlin. And fascinatingly, Rembrandt created these copies for different purposes. The Raphael copy here he made, he used that in the end, really the composition, for his etching of the entombment of 1654. And the copies he made after Titian, he did that particularly for the style of the Venetian master. As you can see in this beautiful classical landscape at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, that is more or less the same style that he got from Titian. So he does it for composition and he does it for style. Finally, there are his drawings after Mughal school miniatures, of which you see here several examples. It seems quite likely that Rembrandt had a whole album with such miniatures. He reused them too in his own work, like you can see in the etching in the right corner that's based more or less on the drawing above in the British Museum. In short, Rembrandt fits the pattern of his contemporary colleagues by mining his collection intensively for his own creations. His collection of drawings does not seem to have been large, and it's difficult to say how exceptional it was. He probably differed from his colleagues more with his collection of graphic art. It is known that several artists from Rembrandt's immediate circle also had drawing collections. I mention here his two pupils, Philip Koning and Govert Flink. With respect to Philip Koning, we don't have an inventory, but we do have drawings he annotated, and we have the advertisement for his auction. According to this advertisement, the auction of his art collection was spread over several evenings and was announced through bills put up in the city. It was a substantial collection, in other words. The advertisement only mentions very fine Italian drawings, one of which was the three crosses, which you see here on the right. Koning attributed it to Andrea Mantegna in a British Museum. It's now under the name of Bellini School. He annotated a further two sheets on the verso with the names of Breenberg and Rembrandt. The Breenberg you see here on the right in Paris, and the Rembrandt he annotated is in the Louvre. You see the recto above and the verso with Koning's inscription. This is his inscription, and what he always does with these three inscriptions that we know, he finishes it with PKO, and these are his initials, and you see the same initials on his own proper drawings. It has been thought that this may be a collector's mark, but since it is the same as his monogram on his drawings, that's sort of unclear. Govert Flink had become a popular portrait painter by the 1640s. He didn't need to paint for a living, partly because he had married quite well. He lived in a big house and collected Greek and Roman sculpture. According to Arnold Houbraker, the well-known biographer of Dutch artists from the 17th century, Flink had a goodly number of paintings, drawings, and prints by famous Italian and other masters. And I'm showing you here the F mark, the famous F mark. It does indeed, you may know it, it's well known. It does indeed stand for Flink, but not for Govert, but for his son Nicholas. This Nicholas had indeed a spectacular collection of drawings that included 500 sheets, many of the really highest quality, landscapes by Rembrandt. You see here 2 Rembrandt drawings on the right and a Van Dyck drawing on the left. The Van Dyck drawing is now in the show downstairs. It's a portrait of Inigo Jones, and here you have again the F mark. Here it's again. So most of these drawings. Well, sorry, I'm going too fast now. There are also very beautiful Italian drawings in the Flink collection, like Castiglione, Pordenone, and Salviati. The F mark was sort of cut off in the Castiglione, at least in this image here, but the F mark is still visible here and there. In 1723, the entire Flink collection was bought in one fell swoop by the second Duke of Devonshire. We know from Pierre-Jean Mariette that Pierre Crozat was intensely disappointed hearing this English sort of taking over. Most of those drawings are still in Chatsworth. Some of them are, of course, sold, and that's this drawing is at the Getty, and this one, the one on the right is the one on the lower right is in the Paul Russell collection. The question here, though, is: did Nicholas amass these treasures himself, or did he inherit some of them of his father Govert? For Houbraken said that Govert also owned drawings, and wouldn't it be logical, especially for the Rembrandt drawings, to have passed to the son by way of the father, the Rembrandt pupil? The sources, unfortunately, are silent about this. We know a bit about these artists, but in most cases, it doesn't amount to very much. Their wills and inventories may have been published, but the descriptions are often so terse that I will not tire you with them. Sometimes it's only because of the newspaper advertisement that we know that an artist was also a collector, like in the case of Philips Kroning. Luckily, in this case, there were also his annotations on the versos. If you don't have this extra, an advertisement is rather meager. I would like to devote the last 5 minutes of my talk to a sort of unknown but utterly fascinating drawing collection by a virtually unknown Dutch artist, David Beck. Exceptionally, the drawings are not that bad described. Although it contains illustrious names, this inventory has not received the attention it deserves. I'm talking about the Delft portrait painter David Beck. This is he, as the court painter to an equally famous collector of drawings, Queen Christina of Sweden. Her portrait is on his easel. She sent him on a tour of the European courts, partly to deliver portraits and apparently for political purposes as well, and perhaps also for the acquisitions of works of art. His inventory, drawn up in 1656, lists the following drawings: 42 drawings by Raphael and Giulio, 85 sketches and drawings by Michelangelo, a book with 56 sheets by Cesare d'Arpino. Well, you can read it for yourself. 94 Italians and 358 mostly Italian drawings. Since Beck was close to Christina with her fabulous Italian collections, one would imagine that these attributions cannot be too far wide of the mark. Contemporaries only mention Beck and his collection in passing, and what they say is rather contradictory. It was said that he had less knowledge of drawings than Christina, but somebody else stated that she took a number of drawings from Beck's collection for herself, which implies that she thought the quality was good. I'm afraid we have no clue how the situation really was. just as we have no clue where Beck acquired these drawings. He was in Rome in 1653, so he could have acquired them there, but this is just a guess. Beck's collection, however, contained more treasures. Before he became Christina's court painter, he had lived in London, where he joined Anthony van Dyck's studio as a pupil and assistant until the latter's death in 1641. He clearly got a large share of his master's estate. Again, I wrote them down for you, and there are many, many drawings by Van Dyck. There is a whole book with drawings by him and a few by Rubens, and then postures by Van Dyck and a few others, 24 drawings by children, 56 drawings of arms and legs, 30 drawings of hands by Van Dyck, well, and etc., etc. Because of this direct link, there's not much reason to doubt the Van Dyck attributions. Since we know very few Van Dyck studies of arms, hands, horses, or animals of this kind, they are not downstairs. I mean, well, the postures are, but not these other ones. They are, in fact, extremely rare. This list is tantalizing. After Christina's abdication, Beck followed her to Rome. 2 years later, in 1656, he returned to the Netherlands, taking his collection with him. He died shortly afterwards. Some sources say he was poisoned. Was there a scandal? Was it somebody from Christina's court who followed him and took back to Michelangelo's? It's unknown. It's just guessing from my side. But he would be good for a novel, this David Beck, because he not only was the court painter for Christina, but he was also, for a short while, court painter for Charles I and the court of Denmark as well. Anyway, since Beck was a portraitist, the Van Dyck drawings would certainly have come in handy, but the Italians would have been less useful. Once again, this was partly a working collection and partly that of an art lover. I've reached the end of my survey. I could easily fill another half hour with other Dutch artists, but in their case as well, we would have to admit that too little is known to arrive at any hard and fast conclusions. What we can say, however obvious it may sound, although not unimportant, is that an enormous amount has been lost. Where are the dozens, if not hundreds, of drawings by Jan van der Capelle, by Adriaan Brouwer, by Pieter Lastman? Where are these portfolios of drawings of children, hands, and horses by Anthony van Dyck? In addition, Dutch artists had collections that were clearly connected with studios and others that were put together because of their visual appeal. The categories almost always overlap. It turns out that the studio collections were by far the most important. The purely art-loving artist was probably a very rare exception. The late 16th century Joris Hoefnagel may have been one, with his Vasarian art collection. The best of them to fit into this category was Jan van der Capelle with his 7,000 sheets, and perhaps Govert Flinck too, if we assume that most of the famous 500 drawings at Chatsworth came from him. In all other cases, including Rembrandt, they mined their collections intensively for their own work. It is a fascinating subject about which a great deal undoubtedly remains to be discovered. Thank you very much.